This is the Community of Practice Transition to Employment series held by myself, the Grants and Partnership Development Officer at the Center for Excellence in Disabilities, Courtney Lanham, Training Specialist at the CED, and Jennifer Tenney, Program Manager and Principal Investigator of the COP project. The CED is part of West Virginia University and WVU Health Sciences Center, which gives us a unique opportunity to partner with various disciplines across the university and within the state when it comes to initiatives and programs at the center. We're also part of a greater national network, the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. And if you can see, we are represented in each state across the country, and each of those programs are statewide services. Our role at the center is to provide education and training, technical assistance, direct services, dissemination of information, and research activities. And we're filling many of those roles through our conversations here with the communities of practice. A little more specific about our center, every county in blue, we do have staff housed. We have our main offices in Mon County and Kanawha County in Big Chimney, but we do have staff housed in all of the blue highlighted counties that also serve those outlying areas. We have 7 programs, 4 clinics, and approximately 90 staff members. You might find us placed in a partner office across the state, such as DHHR or Division of Rehab Services. Anytime we can share space, that's great because we're serving a common caseload in some cases. You can become an affiliate of the CED, and this is a way to stay connected to our initiatives, and that's through research or events that we may be holding. And I'll drop that link in the chat before we leave today. Okay, you have joined us today for a community of practice, and just a reminder of what that is. It's a group of people who share a concern, set of problems, or passion about a topic. In this instance, we're talking about individuals with disabilities, specifically intellectual and developmental disabilities, but our strategies apply to the greater population, and we're looking for inclusivity amongst our employers. And you guys are the people that bring the knowledge and expertise to the table, as well as our guest speakers from around the country that have come to share their best practices and research with us. A COP includes 3 distinct elements: a community that comes together, that's our monthly meeting; a shared domain of interest, again, employment and individuals with disabilities; and a shared practice of experiences, stories, tools, and ways of addressing recurring problems. Where have we been? Where do we need to go? And what tools do we need to get there? Again, this is our last one. You guys know the show by now. We probably will wrap up a little bit early today. I'm still adjusting to the time change and it getting dark so early. And again, we'll hear from Dr. Dave Wittenberg today. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And as you can see, we've reached the end of our program. We've had some fantastic topics over the year. Just to reflect on that for a moment, because we're going to be reflecting on these conversations that we had and what we pulled away from that and where we want to go moving forward. So we've covered a lot of territory. We've had speakers from a variety of regions across the country. And it's interesting that some of our speakers kind of ended up weaving together. Dr. Griggle worked with Dale Verstegen for many years on projects. Dale and Dave have worked for many years on projects together. And then Dina Klimkino, when she was here, she told us that she had some research that she'd been doing with Dr. Wittenberg as well. So it's neat to see how we've invited experts from a variety of places across the country and they're connected to each other. So I think that's a testament that we're on the right track and that we're having the right conversations with the right people. So I just wanted to mention that. And several of our speakers have joined us for the rest of our conversations, such as Ms. Debbie Hopkins on here with us, who is our expert that we're gonna keep around on our team to help us build those best practices here in West Virginia. So we're really thankful for these partnerships that have occurred. A quick highlight, not to throw you up there on the screen, Dave, but I did it. I thought it was important to let people know what your focal areas are and what your background is. So Dave has, and I've worked alongside Dave as a colleague, not for a couple of years now, but starting back in 2007, myself and Jen Tenney, who's with the WIPA program at the CED and with us here. And Dave worked on a project that he's actually gonna highlight a little bit in his discussion. So I've known him for quite a while. I think he's well regarded in the area of research, and he's gonna tell you more about some of the journals and publications that he's been part of that forge pathways for individuals with disabilities. And you can see the focal areas here are really close to what we're looking at: transitions, economic well-being, being able to succeed in the community and be proud of our contributions. So I think he'll have a lot to tell us in that regard. And so I'm going to pass it to him in just a moment. As you guys know, I like to track who we have in our groups. And for the whole program, I'd like to be able to say we had all of the state represented, or maybe we were missing a pocket. I think so far we've been really good about coverage of the whole state, and even some of our outlying friends, Rodney from up in Pennsylvania with the scholarships for Native Americans and things like that. So it's nice to know who we have in the room. So if you would please give me a moment, I'm going to bring up our poll, and I've got my fancy map of West Virginia with the regions that maybe are a little different for us. And so if you can find your region there: Northern Panhandle, Mountaineer Country, Potomac Highlands, Eastern Panhandle, Mountain Lakes, New River, Greenbrier, Hatfield, McCoy, Metro, Mid-Ohio, or other or out of state. And if you're other or out of state, you can drop that in the chat if you'd like to tell us where you're tuning in from. So I'm just going to give it about 30 seconds here, give everybody a chance. I think this will be really interesting data to wrap up this program, to be able to say, you know, this is how many people we were able to reach, and these were the pockets of the state that were most active, and maybe that'll help us highlight some of the best practices we want to work on moving forward. We've got Mustafa tapping in from St. Louis, Missouri. He's a WV in his heart, though. Mountaineer, true to form. Oh, thanks. See, Debbie's already sharing us new resources, and I believe we're celebrating Apprenticeship Week or month. There's something happening. We should always be celebrating apprenticeships. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. I got 71% responding, and let's see where we're coming from. So Mountaineer Country is usually winning. Metro Valley, oh, Mid-Ohio Valley. All right, so Parkersburg area, Wood County, all those good counties over there, Jackson County. So nice to see you guys winning the participation race for the day. So I'll go ahead. How do I close this? Oops. Technical difficulties, excuse me. All right, so thank you for participating in that poll. And I was just warming you guys up because Dave is going to ask you guys for some audience participation throughout his discussion. And he'll tell us a little bit more about that. If you guys have used Mentimeter before, you may need to open up another tab on your desktop or laptop, or you can use your device. And if you're not if you're not able to patch into that website, that's all right. But it's a really cool tool, and I'm sure he's going to tell you more about it. So Dave, thank you so much for being here with us today. As I did mention, Dave and I have been colleagues for a while. I know that his passion is strong, and that his experience and knowledge is really going to build our capacities as a group. So thanks for being here. Whatever else you'd like to share with us about yourself, we would love to hear. Otherwise, I know you've got some good details for us. Oh, we can't hear you, Dave, unless you're.
I'm unmuted. Okay, hit the *6.
There
okay,
we go.
Great. Hopefully you are seeing my opening screen here. And as Mandy mentioned, I'm delighted to be here and seeing some few familiar faces that I worked with in West Virginia on the Youth Transition Project, including Taylor and Jennifer as well. It's good to see you. I'm going to talk about some of those lessons learned from the Youth Transition Project, and admittedly, and I would say this in other forums too, YTD was my favorite project just because it got me launched into a really in-depth program. I'm getting feedback, Mandy. Oops, sorry. Okay, sorry. On youth, and one of the ways that I want to start today is with a Mentimeter poll, and one of the things that Mandy had talked about was best practices from your previous meetings, and I'd like to do a word cloud, and hopefully this is showing up. Is this showing up, Mandy? Name 1 to 2 best practices covered in your community of practices that you would think would have the most impact, and one of the things that I'm going to do today is relate some of these practices that you all name in here in creating a word cloud, and we'll relate them back to some of the things we've learned in serving transition age youth with disabilities who are receiving supplemental security income. So you go to Menti and you fill in go to menti.com, MENTI.com. It'll also work on your phones. Enter code 69575037 and just type in 1 or 2 words. And I'm hoping that this is a good way to build an interactive session with 30 people. But if it isn't, you can also let me know at the end of the presentation not to do this again. So.
We're with you, Dave. Okay, so if you needed that website, it's menti.com, and then you type in that code, and then you should have three fields. Oh, look, someone's got it. Wait, is someone messing with me?
Somebody put motorcycle as the most impact of practices. So
best practices covered in the in all of the COPs. So this is our. We've covered a lot of territory. So what did you take away? And I was going to type apprenticeships. We're going to see how many apprenticeships we get, because that's been one of my favorite. I'm not biased to that one. So look how many people can get to menti.com. And we'll give, what do you think, Dave, 2 minutes for everybody to get to the website?
2 minutes, yeah.
Orient themselves? Cool.
Yeah. We'll go for 2 minutes and we see accommodations, tailored supports, employer outreach, apprenticeship. What's interesting, outside of motorcycle, each of these things were components of the youth transition demonstration that Mandy, Taylor, and Jennifer worked on years ago.
There we go. Now we're adding some words. And just as a reminder, the topics we've covered since February were transitions to post-secondary, transitions to vocational education, preparing employers, and preparing employees. So dig deep into those previous topics.
Got assistive technology, pre-apprenticeship, mentorship is coming up. Apprenticeship is coming up as kind of a big word in the middle. Employer outcomes, disability etiquette is really a critical one. Mentorship, supports. Let me give it another 30 seconds and then we'll talk about how some of these things tie into what we've learned about transition age youth and sort of the best practices here. Okay, all right, I'm going to move to the presentation. And if we get new entries, I'll share them at the end of the presentation. So hopefully you're seeing my slides again, Mandy, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the overview of my talk, the presentation includes 3 parts. First, I'm going to provide context on the Supplemental Security Income Program and the rules and other supports. Second, I'm going to summarize lessons learned from Social Security Administration in funding these demonstrations, these large-scale demonstrations, including working with other agencies. And finally, we're going to highlight learning opportunities. And when we developed this presentation, we developed it specifically with Social Security in mind of where to go in the future based on what we've learned in the past. And for the punchline, here. Supplemental security income operates in a fragmented system of supports, and I suspect many people on this call have experienced that fragmentation. Many of these systems are not connected. There's no single entryway into these programs. And so the theme of the interventions that quote unquote work is that the associated long-term impacts and other demonstrations is that they offered supports that were not in the youth environment. And so when you talk about things like apprenticeships and accommodations and assistive technologies and transition plans, those things that were talked about in the previous Menti polls, those are promising ingredients to helping youth thrive. And one of the potential problems that youth face is not only is it their disability that is a potential challenge, but it is their environment. Many youth with disabilities are growing up in lower income families, and the resources that are available within the systems that provide those supports are often limited. And so in some ways, the result here is hopefully somewhat intuitive, which is if you only work in that environment, which has very sparse resources, the outcomes that you can influence, at least long-term, are going to be limited. Whereas if you bring something outside of that environment, and I'll talk about some of the programs that have been shown to be more effective, such as Job Corps, which takes people out of their environment into a residential job training facility, have promise. So youth with SSI, receiving SSI face complicated incentives. As I mentioned, to the left is one of my favorite exhibits because it comes from a mom of a parent with a disability, and it really shows the fragmentation of the system. And in the center of this diagram is you see the family. And what I love about this is just the color coding. And this is a care map, and this is actually an intervention that was developed based on Kristen Lynn's experience in care mapping. But you can see she had to think about schooling, development assets, health, support, legal and financial aid, recreation, info and advocacy, and things that I suspect many people here are familiar with in dealing with families who are supporting youth with disabilities. All of this takes time. All of this takes time not only to support the child, but also the parents got to support other children in the family. And there's no single entryway into these supports for the family. When you add in SSI on top of this, it becomes even more critical because SSI payments represent half of the family income. Many families are going to be very motivated to maintain SSI eligibility, even at the risk of keeping their other children disabled, so to speak, so they can support their other family. It truly is a lifeline, and SSI has been shown to substantially reduce poverty. There are special rules and reporting for earnings and assets. I think one of the things that's interesting about Social Security programs is once you're on those programs, it's very different from like people that are not on those programs. If you're not on those programs, you just report your earnings to the IRS. If you are on those programs, you report your earnings to SSA, and you also still have to file your IRS form. So there's a dual level of interaction, so it's more time. And finally, the eligibility changes at age 18. So these are pretty substantial barriers that youth with SSI who receive SSI face. So what has SSA done over time? And the scale of SSA youth demonstrations have changed, and I'm going to use some acronyms here, and they're spelled out at the bottom of my sheet, but there were the two early demonstrations called STETS, which is Structured Training and Employment Transitional Services Program, and TTD, Transitional Employment Training Demonstrations. And these were the earliest big demonstrations funded by SSA and Department of Labor in the early 80s. And they targeted youth with intellectual disabilities. And this was really groundbreaking stuff at the time, particularly for those that have been working in the disability field for a much longer period of time, might have recalled some of these debates over sheltered versus competitive employment and transitional employment. These were the first demonstrations to actually test sheltered employment versus transitional employment demonstrations. And the sample size included 745 youth in TTD and 467 youth in STETS. And essentially they both provided transitional employment supports, and they're related. They started STETS at Department of Labor with 467 youth. They generated these large impacts, and they wanted to do something broader, focused on SSI youth, and ran this intervention. Next came up the youth transition demonstration in the early aughts, which is the program that I mentioned. I worked on with Mandy and Taylor and Jennifer. And this was a notable intervention because it was for a target population receiving SSI. It was not impairment specific. It was broad range. It was also targeted to youth age 14 to 25, and it was implemented in multiple states across the country. And it's also notable because the service providers included a mix of private and public providers. Notably in West Virginia, included HRDF and the West Virginia WVUCED, who provided a combination of employment supports with benefits counseling. I note that because Promise says, let's go even bigger. So that target population included approximately 13,000 youth receiving SSI, but a much narrower age range, 14 to 16. And that narrower age range is notable because the age 18 redeterminations. And so SSA said, okay, let's go bigger. Let's partner with other agencies. Those other agencies are going to provide the tailored supports, and SSA is going to provide the evaluation. So what you kind of see at this sort of broad historical angle is SSA moving to become an evaluation agency because they have a lot of rich program data. And it's something that I want to get back to at the end of this presentation, because one of the punchlines is, I think going forward in the future, there are opportunities, particularly in places like West Virginia, to develop grassroots program efforts and partner with SSA to develop YTD-like interventions where the intervention doesn't come top down from SSA with a bunch of parameters. It actually bubbles up from the grassroots level. And as I'll get to in a second, this is going to be one of the lessons learned. So, and finally, what I'll say is in the backdrop of the scale of these demonstrations getting larger, this was during a period where the SSI program grew substantially. In the 80s with the STETS and TTD intervention, the size of the caseload was around 600,000 to 800,000 people, whereas in YTD and Promise, the caseload had increased to approximately 1.1 to 1.2 million youth. So SSI had been growing, and there was strong policy interest. I note that because the roles of SSI children has substantially dropped, and this may be something you're feeling very acutely in West Virginia because there's been all these closures of field offices. But on top of that, there has been a huge push for continuing disability reviews prior to COVID. And so there's been sort of a double whammy on the SSI program, which is not part of the interventions that I study, but is part of the SSA context. And I provide that context to further emphasize, I think there are intervention opportunities within West Virginia because there is going to be a push to do outreach to identify youth who can qualify for SSI. And there's also going to be a push to serve those youth. So the demonstration findings. Consistently, there were short-term impact findings. STETS and TTD, this is more of a historical example, but this was really the start of the competitive employment movement and really bringing evidence basis to why transitional supports and competitive supports could be not only effective in promoting employment, but also be cost effective. And so this was a new concept that was really, really important and moving the entire field. And the youth transition demonstration, there were strong initial short-term impacts, and a lot of those impacts were related to service intensity and focusing on impacts. Like there was a mix of stronger impacts in YTD versus weaker impacts on employment and employment-related activities. In general, to over-contextualize the findings across the 6 sites, the sites that had more intensive service intensity services, like in West Virginia, there was a big emphasis on placing youth into employment and providing intensive job supports. Those interventions tend to have very large substantive early impacts. The problem is that there were limited long-term impacts. And I think one of the challenges we faced in West Virginia was we had to stop service delivery after 18 to 24 months. We couldn't continue to provide service delivery over the long term, and we saw the impacts begin to diminish over time. And our ability to take the youth out of the environment was also limited. And I think that was a very, very important lesson. But the other important lesson is service intensity matters, and you get what you pay for, truthfully. And that was a key lesson. For Promise, which is still ongoing, there are some promising short-term impacts, and the long-term impacts are forthcoming. The findings after 18 months after enrollment is each project has increased the use of transitional services and families members' use of supports, and all had increased youth's receipt of job-related training and employment. 4 projects increased youth's earnings and total income, but only 1 reduced the youth's federal disability payments. The findings underscore the potential for within state agencies to work together to generate impacts to address this system fragmentation. And it had more of an emphasis on family service provision than was possible in YTD. As a matter of fact, that was one of the lessons that were coming out in the initial findings from YTD. So those were the SSA demos. Then we shifted and we looked at sort of all other demonstration projects, those funded by DOL and other agencies, and really trying to look at what was promising for youth with disabilities. And some of the key findings we had was, first, we reviewed 4 different types of service populations. I'm going right to left here, or left to right. First was residential and sectoral training models for other youth populations. We reviewed employer models for youth with disabilities. We reviewed population-specific approaches for adults, such as mental health treatment services, and we reviewed international evidence. There are several findings relating to customize employer supports and placements, but I'm going to focus on those that had the longest long-term impacts, which were from Job Corps and Year Up. The Year Up intervention, as some people may know, I think Year Up is active in West Virginia, though correct me if I'm wrong on that, Mandy, or if anybody on the phone.
I'm Googling it right now, Dave, because I never heard of it. It looks like we have a in Pittsburgh, and the other Virginia and DC would be the other closest. So yeah, I was already like, what is that? Yeah, Europe's an intervention, I think, very much worth looking into. And so it is an intervention that is an intensive year-long program that trains low-income youth for jobs in high-demand fields, such as information technology and financial services. So it's this idea, they call it sectoral training, but it's essentially a fancy way of saying if stuff isn't available in your environment, what they do is they try to take you out of your environment and train you in high demand fields so that you can move into one of these high demand fields longer term. It's a fairly costly program. Let me get to that in a second. Job Corps is the other one that I found to be particularly compelling from this. And Job Corps offers residential supports with the provision of intensive training supports. And when you look at these interventions for youth with disabilities, both
both had impacts on youth. As one example, Year Up increased average earnings by 30 to 40% 5 years after follow-up, and that represented a $7,000 to $8,000 increase. Year Up is not a cheap program, but it was an intensive program. It was very strategic in the skill development and tried to match supply with demand, and I found that to be a very compelling model. There is a consistent theme here, which is intensive supports that offer youth with services not in their environment have the potential for long-term outcome. So what are some of our policy lessons from this? When we think about demonstration lessons, we have, what did we learn here? And I'm showing 5 findings from the demonstration. First, from an intervention design standpoint, youth service needs differ from adults. Perhaps obvious, but there is a need to support the youth and the family when you're thinking about interventions for transition age youth. And thinking back to the care map shown at the beginning, those are some of the pain points that families are facing, particularly in disability, essentially stealing time. Recruitment. One positive is that participation rates in demos such as Youth YTD and Promise were higher than their predecessors. And I think a big factor in that is that we had local staff, meaning not me, calling from Mathematica or sending letters or cold calling people. We had people from HRDF, people like Mandy and Taylor, who knew youth in the area doing that recruitment. And so there's an authenticity in that recruitment pattern. And so there was this big factor of local staff and program incentives enhancing the willingness of people to participate. And this is a big deal in trying to get buy-in to get anybody to do any sort of intervention, because it is a big investment of time. And as I noted earlier, a lot of these youth are being starved of time for a variety of reasons. So in short, a local presence is needed. And I think you're going to see that emerge with SSA in terms of what they're funding in the future. Short-term outcomes, intensive models generate larger impacts, which is shown in YTD. In terms of long-term outcomes, long-term impacts through the expansion in training employment opportunities that address systematic gaps. Like, not only did we have that in Year Up and Job Corps, but if you think of like those early demonstrations that I had mentioned, STETS and TETD for youth with intellectual disabilities, what did they do? They took youth out of a sheltered environment and provided them transitional supports. They changed their environment, transformative impacts. And finally, in interagency collaborations, formal agreements backed by funding, enhanced collaborations. Namely, if you're going to develop an agreement, I know this sounds basic, but contracts help. A lot of times we have smaller agencies working with each other and there's sort of a handshake deal. And that is great to build morale at the beginning, but contracts really specify who's going to do what, when, where, and why. And that was a really important early lesson, both in some of the positives of Promise, but also the early struggles. So, translating research to policy. How are the findings that I just mentioned translated from research to policy? There are more modest effects as they didn't lead to programmatic change. The Supplemental Security Income Program still has the same general programmatic rules. It did lead to changes in services, though. So if you're wondering, okay, what did we do from YTD? For SSA programs, this may sound basic, but for the first time ever, benefits counseling started to focus on youth and their families. And if you look at Social Security's information online, there is a lot more focus on youth and their families. And people that work at the UCED probably have experienced this longer term, that there was not this focus back prior to 2000. And there was a very big sea change at SSA in thinking about youth and their families in this Banff, Wisconsin. Second, and I think this is also really important, is it informed cross-agency approaches to service provisions. YTD especially emphasized the need for customized services, and that was used to inform the Work Incentives Opportunity Act implementation and policy proposals, as well as several ongoing proposals that are currently under consideration through DOL and SSA. And this other one is more subtle, but what you see is SSA trying to play more to their comparative advantage, which is to evaluation, which I mentioned at the top. And when you talk about labor and education, those agencies specialize in delivering employment and education services. So you're seeing this evolution of agencies specializing to their comparative advantage. And I think what you're going to see more of in the future is a split between the interventions and the evaluations, where DOL and Rehabilitation Services Administration, which has been funding in numerous opportunities and will have opportunities in the coming year, funding interventions that often leverage SSA administrative data. And those SSA administrative data are really important because they're kind of like the stopping point of like telling you how many people wound up on SSI, how many people wound up on DI. Plus, SSA has access to the master earnings file, so they can tell you who's employed and who's not in the administrative records. They can also tell you who dies and who doesn't using death data. So the SSA administrative records are really, really powerful, not only for SSA demonstrations, but for all demonstrations, and trying to think about kind of what are the key outcomes of program participation, employment, and death. So what are the suggestions for future learning that we had going forward? Where do we go from here? First of all, one of the things that we suggested from SSA was don't build it from scratch. Try to build from existing resources, and referrals to models with strong evidence. Year up. One of my favorite quotes is "Good artists borrow, great artists steal," and that should be a point of emphasis with any sort of intervention development. Innovation comes from borrowing what works in several different contexts and applying it to the particular populations that we're serving. And one simple example of this is referrals to models with strong evidence. So getting youth referred to Year Up, and I realize many of you mentioned that Year Up is not in West Virginia, it's in Pittsburgh, but to the extent that if Year Up does come to West Virginia, I think that's a program to look at. But Job Corps is also another one, which is a well-established program. I don't want to pitch Job Corps as a panacea for all youth with disabilities because it's not set up necessarily to serve youth with disabilities in a residential framework, but there's a lot of compelling evidence that suggests those with disabilities benefit, sorry, my automated light, benefit from these programs. And there are potential ways to think about even customizing Job Corps to be more supportive of SSI youth, because there seems to be pretty extensive evidence that they've worked quite well. In terms of building from existing resources, expand SSA data usage with other public and private agencies. An area for future consideration is how to best leverage and document areas where SSA has already had data sharing agreements. They're already involved in many states, and they've created data exchanges for operational purposes with several states. These exchanges are notable because they may already include linkages to multiple data systems. So this is something to consider within West Virginia of, is SSA already sharing data, for example, with employment networks or Rehabilitation Services Administration, and are there formal networks? And if there are formal frameworks, can those be leveraged in ways that can inform your own mini demonstration projects within West Virginia? In terms of the intervention and outcome focus, there's been a strong focus on employment and program participation, which has historically been the objectives of the SSA demonstrations. One of the things we suggested is thinking beyond that and improve family outcomes and enhancing an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think one of the things that is a very fair critique of SSA demonstrations is when you take a look at a variable like race, SSA doesn't measure race well at all because SSA considers it not part of the disability determination. And so when you get to the administrative records, that information is often missing or messy, and that compromises some of the things that can be done in looking at the effects of systemic issues on the population. So that's a caveat to some of our findings that that was very difficult to say, what is the impact of these interventions in light of, say, systemic issues that might exist with ableism or racism that might be present in certain areas. So in terms of what SSA could do, one of the things, and this was much more of a targeted SSA approach, one of my frustrations is that a lot of these interventions haven't led to formal changes in SSA policy. And when you think about supplemental security income, that program tends to change more with the news and administrative funding than it does with evidence. And as one example of that, I'm going to just point to the continuing disability reviews, which increased substantially between 2015 and 2020. During that period, there were 1.3 million SSI children, I think at the start, or 1.2 million SSI children at the start of that period, and there were almost 1.4 million continuing disability reviews done. And this is really notable because there was hardly any reviews done prior to that period. And this reflected not necessarily any sort of programmatic change. It just represented that Congress gave SSA enough funding to fulfill their obligations to do continuing disability reviews. And so there's been this sort of seesaw of when they do continuing disability reviews and when they don't. And that's complicated not only from a policy standpoint, but also, if you're a family and you've been on SSI for years and you haven't had a continuing disability review, and all of a sudden you are having those reviews, what happens if you haven't thought of transition planning off? And that's a key problem because there's a lot of evidence that youth who fall off SSI don't show up again in any program records or earnings records. So there's big concern that they may fall into the justice system, particularly for those with mental health issues. So how can we test this? Well, one idea is waiver-only demonstrations of program rules that affect youth outcomes. Things that I would like to see tested are things like completely waiving any earnings reporting. As you may have heard me say earlier in the presentation, SSA, if you're an SSI recipient, you have to report your earnings to SSA and to the IRS. For me, I'm not sure why we'd ever want a youth to report their earnings to SSA. It just strikes me as a non-issue. We should just exempt all earnings and see if that influences earnings. But you could apply the same rules to parents. And if you change the deeming rules for parents, that can influence the employment outcomes of those families as well as the independent living outcomes of families. So that's one option for sort of a waiver only. And when you think about these waiver only demonstrations, they're not like complicated to test. You give one group just this waiver and you give this other group not current rules, and you just compare them, and you've got a random assignment demonstration right there. Continuing disability reviews, I just went on my thesis of continuing disability reviews going off and on. I think we should bring better evidence and of what what is a planful continuing disability review so that we can understand the effects of CDRs and outcomes. There's a lot of evidence that CDRs save a bunch of money for the general funding, but we don't know what happens to youth after they leave those programs. And then looking at expanded definitions of the age 18 redetermination. This is very similar to changing the CDR, but there's been I've seen many cogent arguments argue for expanding the age to age 22 just from a cognitive standpoint, because youth's brains don't fully form, actually, and I found out not until age 27, but 22 is the age that dovetails with IDEA. In terms of benefits counseling, this is another one that might resonate with the WVUCED. Currently, benefits counseling is reactive. We serve who shows up, and it's very hard to be much more proactive. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I vividly remember from the YTD days is talking to some of the VR counselors and said, we already like YTD for one simple reason. It gives us a list. We know who the youth are and we can finally serve them. And that's really important. And so one idea for WIPAs, which is work incentives planning and assistance, is to test proactive service outreach. Now that it would take a lot more funding for the service model, and that would be a very, very different intervention, but it certainly would be interesting to see what would happen when we proactively reach out to youth as opposed to waiting reactively from a behavioral intervention perspective. And then outreach notices. This is one of my favorites. Years ago, I was involved in a discussion with SSA about sending age 18 redetermination notices because they weren't sending these notices. So a lot of youth were just showing up at the age 18 redetermination, not knowing what the processes were. And they responded by developing information, but it's 20 pages long. So testing different types of outreach of like one-page letters, those things matter, particularly when you're talking about people who have multiple things going on in their lives, and just simple things that can be done with outreach of changing wording in letter, changing how the outreach is done, using email versus text, shortening the alternatives. I suspect there are many different ways to send this 20-page notice, and it can be hard because writing up this information's got to go through legal review and whatnot. But I think we often focus on the legal aspect of this as opposed to the accessibility aspect of this, and bringing more balance to the outreach notices that do both of them. So I've talked for quite a bit there, Mandy. I'm at the end of my presentation with the last slide. Sorry, I should conclude with where we started thinking about the fragmented system of supports, which is it's complicated, and a general theme is offering supports that provide consistent income streams, which is a key finding from the literature from Manasi Deshpande. The trick is finding interventions that can create stabilities. The lesson suggests that it's very possible to do so in the short term, but it's much harder to do in the long term. With the lessons in the short term are that employment impacts are common, especially with customized employment supports. The problem is continuity. Long term is less frequent and takes more effort to navigate that web. And the strongest models often offer services that are not in the youth's environment. In terms of learning, I would emphasize building on the successes of SSA's data capacities and creating data sharing. And for intervention development, leverage referral options to those interventions that have long-term impacts. So when you think about voc rehab, are there options to refer to Job Corps services? And finally, for testing specific rules, I noted that there's a bunch of options for waiver-only tests. So that is essentially the summary. And as we kind of look to some of the things that we had of naming the best practices and community of practices at the beginning of the presentation, apprenticeships are things that I think would be categorized as potentially valuable because they're taking a youth out of their environment into a new environment. The question I would have about apprenticeships is, are they taking a youth out of their environment into a high demand future long-term earnings environment? That was a key point of youth build and perhaps a focus of for those interested in apprenticeship models. But certainly having things like accommodations and transition plans and perhaps a motorcycle to take yourself out of the environment is critical. So let me stop talking and take some questions now. I'm not sure how to stop the share. There we go.
Thank you, Dave. That was a wealth of information. I wish I would have taken my notes like in order down my page, instead of drawn all over my page, because now I'm trying to make sense of all my notes. I thought it was really interesting to hear about the drop off of the age 18 youth and that they're not showing up in the earnings reports. And I think it's interesting that we think maybe there's justice system involvement there, or we're sitting on the couch. I mean, I think we've all been into populations that have left high school, have not gone into, you know, something positive to do, work or school, and they've got that sitting on the couch syndrome. And that was a lot of what we found with YTD and the random assignment. And Dave was so kind to say that I was able to blend in with the locals, because I had just moved here from New Mexico, and I was knocking on people's doors, you know, in Tucker County, Preston County, all over the place, and saying, hey, do you guys want to come be part of the transition demonstration? And they'd be like, well, you're not from here, are you? Because really small communities, and they would know if I was from there. But Taylor was really helpful in that aspect. And it is true that people want someone local, and they want someone that they trust. Even if they don't know you, there's just something about that proximity that makes you more willing to participate. So I agree with that, Dave. Any specific questions? You were too thorough. I was really glad to see you mentioned Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. I had just written down in my notes, connect this to WIOA, and then your next slide connected it. Specifically, I was thinking about the importance of program incentives. You know, people, and I think, Dave, the ones you were referring to is, you know, we were gathering data from past participants, and it was something as simple as a $25 Walmart card for responding to a 10-minute survey on the phone asking you about your current work situation. And those little things are going to be, you know, they're really helpful. It might just be, you know, that lets us go and buy something nice for ourselves, or maybe it's for us to buy groceries, but those little things definitely encourage participation. And if you're familiar with the WIOA workforce programs, the adult and youth programs have a lot of incentives built in. Like if you finish a certificate, you get a bonus, some supports with buying tools and clothes, some incentives for gas to get back and forth to work. So those little things help. Sometimes it's just a pat on the back is the incentive you need, but other times a little bit of money can go a long way.
Indeed. Indeed. I'm just looking at the chat
here.
box next.
Yes, there will be a recording. We have a full YouTube playlist. So if you're on the email list, if you registered for this meeting, then you'll be connected by my group emails, and I'll send out the recording. Actually, Debbie Hopkins had to hop off. She's our apprenticeship expert, but she sent me a note that she had some trainings that she's going to send along specific to inclusivity for apprenticeships. They had a big training this week in the National Apprenticeship field. So I'll send that along. I like connecting you guys to resources. So thanks for asking, Nathan. Yes, it will be available. And Mustafa, so Dave, Mustafa works specifically with refugee population, and it's, I think, underserved. Maybe it's just not a demographic that's been focused on enough, but Mustafa's doing a great job of bringing that to light. He started with some of his research here at the CED and has since moved to Missouri. But the refugee population, do you have any comment on that, Dave? Have you been involved with anything? G related?
I haven't specifically with refugees, though. It's interesting, Andy, as you were talking about representation of people in the area and how important it was to have somebody like Taylor who was local to the area. I would imagine for Mustafa, having refugee representation in that design of whatever transitional services are available would be clearly central to getting buy-in. And this may be perhaps a more obvious point, but a lot of times we don't get the input of the populations we serve, and we're not fully, the service providers are not representative of the populations we serve, which makes for a challenge in providing those services. So one of the findings I would say is trying to build trust and collaboration and representation with the refugee community would be very important. And there are things that you can do, I think, on diversity, equity, and inclusion to help that. I'm an economist. I love numbers, but this was not my idea. But it goes all to data measurement. I asked the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Johnson & Johnson, I'm like, what one thing would you do to measure, like, are you going to be inclusive? And I think this goes along with refugees, which is, she said, just use data to track, for example, who your service providers are, who's progressing, what they look like. And sometimes you can look yourself in the mirror and have to ask very hard questions, and it can change your strategy. I've developed this idea of just simply, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just demographics, but it's also diversities in terms of skill sets and in backgrounds, which is critical. And I work on a board here in New Jersey, and we looked at ourselves and we did this diversity, equity, and inclusion exercise just based on data. Didn't like where we are, realized we had to change our strategy, and it was very helpful in pivoting us because we weren't talking conceptually about should we do a training or things like that. We were looking at what are our numbers and where do we have to strategically go. It really motivated action. So that was a long-winded way of saying that, Mustafa. So.
No, that's great, Dave. And I think that those were really good points. And I love what you said about representation, because if you guys have ever heard like the Beltway dilemma, a lot of policy comes from DC and areas where West Virginia is not well represented. And I'm thinking back to YTV and Jen Tenney, you'll probably remember this. We were trying to write a plan to achieve self-success, which helps self-sufficiency, which allows a Social Security beneficiary to set money aside rather than giving it back to Social Security based on their earnings. And we have them set money aside to buy a vehicle. So you can put money in that account for gas, oil changes, tires, all that stuff. And it goes to a regional board to review. And they said, I think he was from Harrison County, and they said, well, can't he just take the subway? We're not going to approve this past plan for a car. The subway. Clearly, they had never been to West Virginia. So I think it's really important to have that local angle and, like you say, representation. And there was something else I wanted to draw out of what you just said too, but I got my own thoughts. So we'll just leave it at that. Jen, do you remember that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely remember that. And I tell that story all the time because it's just a way of showing that, how underrepresented places are and people are. And we just need to remember that, when we're looking at whether or not we're doing the right, I mean, even in the, like Dave said, race is not a demographic that Social Security really considers when they are looking at whether or not they're serving the right people and are they really serving everybody. And I would tend to probably say no to that.
Probably some gaps if we looked a little closer. And I remembered what my other thought was. It was just the fact that I had taken some notes throughout all of our conversations. I think we've mentioned the peer-to-peer aspect, whether it's talking to employers, job seekers, getting buy-in from their peer job seekers, agencies talking with each other, and family, especially when it comes to fear of loss of benefits. And throughout the YTD project, we had something called Career Connections, and they were focused on doing something fun. And so we would meet at a bowling alley and have a pizza party. And then Jen or another WIP benefits counselor would do a 30-minute presentation on a specific benefits topic. Maybe it's reporting your income to Social Security, and bowled together. And we could have, I mean, our presentations were really good, but where the real rubber hit the road was families were like, oh, your child went to work and you guys are okay. And we've heard that in all of our presentations since February, that peer-to-peer connection. And so when we think about wrapping up all of our thoughts and moving forward and taking a next step, I'm really seeing that as a common theme. And I'm interested here if you guys agree. I've heard it, I think, every single month that we've come together, regardless of who the audience is, they want to hear from someone similar to themselves. Do you guys think that's true? Maggie says yes. Anna says yes. All right. Love it. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to wrap this up into a concept. We're trying to make a product, whether it's a video or a brochure or a rack card that goes out. And it's going to help the whole state, all ages, all industries. We were talking last week in preparation of this. And of course, his area of focus is youth. And we've heard from a lot of people, focus is youth, youth build. And I don't set out to focus on youth. I just intend to focus on transitions. But the more I think about it, if we don't fix what's happening as our youth transition out of the schools, we're not going to be able to approach what's happening to our older workers that are changing industries. Maybe it's a physical limitation, or maybe the industry doesn't have a bright outlook. But I really think that if we find the tools that to support the youth of our communities, it's going to start working for all of our populations.
I think that proactive approach that Dave mentioned would be for WIPA would be the best way to do it. You know, we are a reactive agency, and you know, there are days that we sit and we just wait for the phone to ring, and I don't think that's the way that Social Security really, they try to push out a lot of information to the youth about going to work. But if they also had someone following up with phone calls about work from the agency that's talking, you know, from the Social Security Administration, I think that would be a huge help to your point, Mandy, to putting all people to work. If we start with the youth, then I think we change the world.
If we can get the youth to work, we can get anybody to work, right?
Anybody to work. Yeah.
And Dave, I really appreciated your comment on the 20-page, you know, like Jen said, Social Security might send out materials, but if it's a page document, and my gosh, if you all have a caseload, or if you've ever had a caseload, you've probably had a client bring to you something that's been automatically generated by Social Security. And it's not always easy to understand, and it always has a deadline. And if something is stressing you out, like making you nervous, you might miss that deadline. So yeah, I definitely agree that I could see a demonstration down the road, and call us up and invite us, Dave, if you go that direction, to just making it a more accessible, making services and supports more accessible and understandable to the general person that's just coming up through these systems.
Yeah, a few thoughts on that, Mandy. One is for demonstrations, I think there are going to be real opportunities for voc rehab centric interventions with Rehabilitation Services Administration monies that are going to be coming out in the spring. And the only way those work is if you start planning now and thinking about what the interventions are now. So I think that there's a real opportunity if you can coalesce an intervention among the rehab providers would be sort of point one in terms of planning, but also beyond VR, there is opportunities, I think, both with foundations and Social Security Administration if you have interventions that have started, so to speak, but you're looking for an evaluation, a lot of times you have these funders out there that are looking for that tipping point of like, okay, if somebody can fund the intervention, we'll fund the evaluation for you. We'll provide all of the data. We might even be able to provide some additional fundings for the intervention. So if you have those ideas, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to talk with you, but I'd also be happy to talk with you generally about your programs. If you want to do a simple evaluation test, and I did this way back in West Virginia, of whether or not your program is working, ask your service providers and ask your service population, what is the primary goal of the program, and see if they align. And this may sound overly simplistic, but a lot of times there are some very complicated interventions with case management services, and people have differing views of what is the intended service provision or what the outcomes was. And I remember sitting in a room in West Virginia at a focus group with my tie on, completely out of place. And I asked the service group, I was like, what is the goal of the intervention? And I got 12 snarky responses, but they were all the responses that I wanted, which is they all looked at me and they're like, the program is called Youth Works. It's Youth Works. The goal is employment. And it was almost like they were asking me, well, I get paid for this? But to me, that was a very reassuring answer, because people understood the primary goal of the program was employment. It wasn't when the case manager showed up at the person's house, you're going to hear explanations of the 10,000 different crises that are going on, and they're all very real. But unless you focus your service provision on an outcome that you're intended to improve, all the other services can go kaput. And I think one of the things that was really effective, one of the better lessons learned, was they used data. Taylor's team used data to track the amount of service intensity to each youth, and then talk with service provider, like their case managers of, okay, you're providing 50 hours to this one youth, but 1 hour to the remaining 30. And it allowed the people who are dealing with real human beings to think about, am I doing this in an equitable way? Am I doing this in a way that can have impact? And it also provided further the emphasis to the service provider, the case manager, that employment was the primary outcome. Because a lot of times when you're dealing with service provision, it's hard. I mean, you're dealing with people with housing problems. They're on the verge of homelessness. There is all different sorts of crises going on. And to focus on employment can seem so far away in this provision, but if you don't have that laser focus, you're never going to achieve your outcomes. So that's just sort of one bit of like evaluation, like, is this going to work? It goes back to, Mandy, your people talking with people point.
Yeah, I like that. I like that simple test. Just what do we do, and see if you get similar responses. And I also appreciate, and I just want to make sure everyone understood that, because we've got a lot of service providers here in the call. We've got some rehab services, some friends from just some local agencies, Disability Action Center, Squad. We've got some workforce representatives that join us on this call, some Board of Education, and I'm sure I'm missing lots of involvement, as well as our clients and our job seekers. We don't have as much representation of individuals with disabilities and employment-specific industries as we would like. As you know, it's usually easy to bring our service providers to the table, and our goal is to draw in those employers and make that conversation bigger, and of individuals with disabilities to find out exactly what supports we're lacking and how we can lift people up to be more successful. Where was I going with that, Dave? Oh, with mathematical policy research, he mentioned that if you have a research element, you can reach out and partner with them. And so please take advantage of that as you're looking at grant funded opportunities and foundation funded opportunities. We talked with Dale Verstegen, and he gave us some great studies and data to show need. So we're trying to build our capacities here in West Virginia as a result of this. And that might mean, okay, someone at the VA wants to run with an apprenticeship program. during the COP, got inspired by it. We want to draw in some of our partners here. So I think that this group can build those linkages. And then we've got people like Dina Klimkina from the Council of State Governments that's offered support. We've got Debbie Hopkins that's offered support in the apprenticeship industry field. And now Dave is offering that Mathematica policy research could potentially get on board with data collection. And because if we don't have that data and research backing it, we're not able to say this is evidence-based or these are best practices that we've identified. We're just moving forward with our own experiences. But much like getting partnerships formalized on contracts, getting our data best practices down on paper and backed by federal organizations and that sort of credibility is going to help increase our funding across the state and allow us to do more. So I appreciate that you mentioned that.
And Mandy, I should also add, I would love to do grant-funded application, but if you ever just want to talk about your program, don't feel like, oh, I'm going to burn some time. I have conversations all the time about people's programs. Sometimes I'm useful, sometimes I'm useless, just to warn you, because I may not know your program, but I have conceptual ideas, certainly about where things have gone wrong, at least in the past, for different programs and options for improving them. I mean, these are things that I take in my own opportunity working with a foster care agency here in central New Jersey, because I can realize that putting together an intervention and thinking about data collection and doing all of this stuff while you're in the middle of trying to serve populations when resources are already spread thin and you're already working a lot and it's COVID and there's a lot of stuff going on, can be a lot. And so I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but don't be afraid to reach out if you ever have a question.
Your willingness to collaborate has already made you useful. So
okay.
whether you help us come to a conclusion or not, great. Coming together is always good. So, okay. Any last questions, Dave? I know I've taken up more of your time than I anticipated, Dave, but I appreciate all of the information. Any other last questions? Okay. So yeah, thank you so much. So I'm gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna share a couple things in the chat. We're not gonna go through our full series of questions today because I think the content that we got was more valuable. So we'll go with that. But I did want to share with you guys the affiliate link. If you want to join the CED affiliate list and be in tune with our activities and research initiatives. And I also want to share, I know we usually start losing people. I know it's the end of the day. I only get credit for you all participating if you complete my Qualtrics survey. So if you could please click on that before you leave. I'll also send it out with our materials, which are going to include Dave's contact information if you'd like to take him up on that consultation and talk about programs. It'll include some resources from Debbie Hopkins regarding some inclusive approaches that they presented this week as part of National Apprenticeship Week. And it's not going to include a date for the next COP because this is our last one, but it is going to include a date for a wrap-up session, and I'm going to send it to everybody. We have 182 people registered for these COPs. Some of those are our speakers that have come and gone, and some of us have registered multiple times because we lose our link. Not me, I don't know what we're talking about there, but that's a lot of people. And so I want to try to get as much information from that group while I still have your attention, and the grant is still funded. Again, this is funded through the West Virginia Developmental Disabilities Council to help us create a product to get information out across the state to employers, job seekers, and service providers alike on how to expand inclusivity and opportunities for individuals with disabilities to find sustainable employment. So in case you've forgotten why we've come together, that is our main purpose. And so I've collected a lot of our thoughts over the last several months, and it looks like this. We also have one for vocational and higher education, post-secondary education. Of course, I don't have Dave's details filled in yet, but it's all of the takeaways from our conversations for the last 4 months. And then there's another sheet prior to that. So I'll share both of those sheets with the whole group so that everybody can kind of revisit our topics and our takeaways. And then I'm gonna try to wrap it up as nice as Dave's word cloud, steps to move forward with the information that we've covered, which is a lot of information. So I appreciate all of you. Again, if you could please fill out the Qualtrics link. And I lost the affiliate link. I had it copied and I lost it. So I'll go ahead and share that when I send out the email with follow-up information as well. So with that being said, any questions, comments? You guys are a great group. As I mentioned, we've got a wide representation of service providers, individuals with disabilities, and we're across the whole state. So I think that this has been a very successful endeavor. I've enjoyed our speakers. I think you guys have as well. Again, those will be part of our YouTube playlist. As soon as I get subtitles loaded onto this video, I will share that with the group. So thank you all for your participation. Again, this is our last one. We will have a wrap-up session that I'll send out, and if you're available for that, we'd love to have you come together again. Thank you all very much. Take care.